In the last winter of World War II, when the world was collapsing into ash and silence, one forgotten man walked out of the Lapland wilderness, carrying a secret worth more than life itself. They thought he was just an old miner. They stole his gold and left him for dead. But some spirits don't break. They awaken. And when they do, even an army learns what true fear feels like. The final winter of war, when the world was burning, one man went looking for gold and found something far older and harder than metal waiting inside himself. The year was 1944, and the north of Finland lay under a low sky that seemed exhausted by the years of gunfire and retreat. Snow had buried the scars, but not the memory. The forests were stripped and blackened in places where fire had run wild. Villages were skeletal silhouettes on distant hills, their roofs collapsed, their chimneys standing like mute witnesses to everything that had been taken and everything that could never be returned. The war was officially winding down, but up here, in the endless white of Lapland, endings did not come clean. They dragged on, thin and fragile, like smoke that refused to disappear. The Germans were leaving, but they were not leaving quietly. As the Wehrmacht retreated northward toward Norway, they burned bridges, mined roads, and torched anything that might be useful to the people they had once called allies. What had been a harsh but livable land became a booby-trapped wasteland, full of ruins, buried explosives, and sudden absences. Where a village had stood, now there was only a patch of scorched earth and twisted metal. Where a road had connected one lonely settlement to another, now there was only a broken path, cut by craters and lined with warning stakes. The wind carried the smell of ash and something metallic, like rust and spent shells. This was the world that Aatami Korpi walked through, alone. He did not look like a hero, and certainly did not think of himself as one. He was broad-shouldered, sunken-eyed, and quiet in the way that comes from seeing more than anyone should. His beard was rough, his clothes worn but layered with methodical care against the biting Lapland cold. A rope was tied behind his reindeer, dragging a small sled patched together with stubborn practicality. On it, he carried what little he had decided to keep. A rolled tent, shovel, a pan for sifting, tools for working the earth, and a rifle that looked like it had stories he no longer wanted to tell. Aatami had once worn a uniform. Now he wore only the silence of a man who had slipped out of history's main road and taken a side trail into nowhere. The Lapland wilderness around him was both enemy and refuge. Snowdrifts rose like frozen waves around tangled forest. Rivers ran black and slow beneath brittle skin of ice. The wind scraped over the open fells and whispered through the burned remains of barns and houses. Overhead, the sky shifted between steel, gray, and pale, cold blue, as if it too was tired of choosing sides. In this silence, every sound was amplified. The crunch of his boots, the soft drag of the sled, the soft grunt of the reindeer, the occasional distant thud of something detonating far off where some forgotten mine had finally found a victim. The war was still out there, echoing at the edges. But Aatami lived between those echoes. He had one task, one purpose, and it had nothing to do with nations or flags. Gold. It had started as a rumor, something half-believed, whispered around campfires before everyone scattered. People said the rivers of the north still hid veins of it, that if a man had the patience and the will to dig, he might find enough to buy back the years he had lost. Aatami did not believe in buying back anything, but he believed in work. He believed in earning whatever future might exist after so much had been erased. So he had gone into the wilderness with a pan and a shovel, following the rivers that coiled like black threads across the white. Day after day, he knelt in the bitter cold water, hands numb, shoulders aching, sifting silt and gravel, then stumbling back to his camp as the northern sky dimmed and the first stars pierced the thin daylight. Most days gave him nothing. Some days gave him hope, and then took it away again. He kept going. Then, one afternoon, as the low sun brushed the horizon, with a faint smear of gold that seemed to mock him, his pan caught something that did not look like ordinary riverstone. It was small at first, flecks clinging to dark grit, dazzling faintly when he tilted the pan just so. His heart did not leap. It tightened. He washed and sifted again, slower now, more careful. More flecks. Then, a fragment, rounded like a tiny tooth, glowing warm against the icy water. Then, another. He worked until his knees ached and his fingers refused to bend, until he had a small but undeniable collection of gold in the bottom of a pouch that had once held ammunition. It was real. In a world of lies, chaos, and crumbling empires, here was something solid and indifferent to human madness. Aatami looked at it and felt, not joy, but a strange, quiet steadiness. Gold would not bring back the people he had lost, nor erase what he had seen. But it offered a different kind of promise. A small cabin, far from any border. Tools that were not meant to harm anyone. Food that did not depend on ration cards or luck. A life defined by seasons instead of orders. He spent the next days methodically returning to the river, working in a rhythm that felt almost like prayer. Each evening the pouch grew heavier. Each morning he rose in the same silence, his body moving through pain as though it were simply one more element of the weather. This was Sisu in its purest form. Not a burst of fearless charge, but a slow-burning refusal to stop. Persistence without witnesses. Defiance without words. No one would sing about what he did here, and that suited him. This was not for history. This was for survival. When he judged he had enough, he did not linger. The Lapland winter did not bargain, and neither did the war. The Germans were still somewhere to the north, moving like a wounded animal, unpredictable and armed. The Finns were scattered, rebuilding, regrouping, trying to understand what came next. Aatami loaded the pouch of gold carefully into a hidden compartment inside his sled, wrapped under blankets and tools that looked too worn to be worth stealing. He checked the harness on his reindeer, tightened the ropes, and scanned the horizon. The river glittered faintly behind him, innocent and dark. Ahead lay the long, uncertain route toward some semblance of civilization, a village, a road, a rail line that hadn't been blown apart. He set off, each step of the animal's hooves pressing into the snow like a quiet promise that this journey would be his last one under the war's shadow. The day was unnervingly calm as he moved across the open stretch of frozen marshland, the sled whispering behind him. A faint wind rose, tugging at loose strands of his hair, and the sky brightened just enough to make the snow blaze with a cold, white glow. The gold hidden beneath the blanket seemed to pulse with invisible weight, anchoring his plans, his future, his stubborn belief that he could simply walk out of this broken world. And then, as he crested a small rise, he saw movement ahead, shapes against the snow that were too rigid, too organized to be anything but soldiers. A German patrol, weary but alert, trudging south where they should have been going north, their eyes scanning the emptiness for threats or opportunity. The sun caught a brief glint off the edge of his sled, a tiny shimmer where the blankets had shifted. One of the soldiers turned his head sharply, squinting. The patrol slowed. Aatami Korpi, who had survived so much by staying unseen, felt the weight of their gaze land on him and on the fortune he dragged behind, and in that frozen moment, it was clear the war was not done with him yet. They weren't soldiers anymore, just wolves in stolen uniforms, hungry for blood and gold. In the waning months of 1944, the German retreat through northern Finland had become a long, disordered march across lands they had already burned behind them. What once resembled military discipline had thinned into something ragged and feral. Among those retreating columns moved the convoy of Captain Bruno Heldorf, a man whose reputation was carried not by rank or duty, but by a cold hunger that survived even when armies collapsed. Bruno had entered Finland years earlier under the banner of an organized force, rigid and self-assured. Now he commanded a shrinking line of trucks patched with scavenged parts, their paint blistered by cold wind and scorched villages. His convoy traveled through a land that felt more like an accusation than a country. Smoke still drifted from huts reduced to charcoal skeletons. Barns hung open with boards curled like burnt paper. Frozen fields lay abandoned, the footprints of families leading toward forests where they had hidden themselves from men who once claimed to be liberators. The war had outlasted every justification, leaving only the wreckage of choices that could never be undone. Women who had been forced to labor for the soldiers were gathered in one of the rear trucks, silent, their eyes reflecting exhaustion more than fear. The soldiers around them no longer bothered with discipline, speaking in low, restless tones as they scavenged clothing, food, tools, anything that might buy them a few more days of comfort on the road to a future no one could quite imagine. Finland, once an ally, had turned against them, and now every village they passed seemed to glare through the frost with a kind of quiet retribution. The retreat had ground their pride to dust, leaving only instinct. Bruno surveyed the frozen road ahead from the front seat of a commandeered vehicle. The land stretched white and vast, with broken telegraph poles, tilting like abandoned sentries. He was a man carved from ambition, not loyalty. Even now, with the Reich cracking behind him, he kept his uniform immaculate, boots polished, jacket fastened with precise tension, as though refusing to let the world see how far he had fallen. His eyes were gray, sharp, and constantly searching not for enemies but for opportunity. War had stripped everyone down to their truest form. His was greed shaped into discipline. The convoy pushed through an open stretch of tundra where the snow glittered under a pale, strained sun. There, ahead on the road, moved a solitary figure, leading a reindeer and sled. At first glance, Aatami Korpi looked like a man who had been spared by irrelevance, an old miner, worn by cold and loneliness, walking as though the world had forgotten him. His clothes were rugged, patched by his own hands. His beard carried frost. He seemed too small a presence to interrupt the march of a retreating force. Bruno almost signaled his men to drive past without pause. But the slightest shift of light changed everything. As the vehicles approached, one of Bruno's corporals noticed a faint glint near the edge of the sled's blankets. It wasn't the flash of metal from a tool or the dull shine of the sled's bindings. It was something warmer in tone, something heavier in meaning. When Korpi stepped aside to let the convoy pass, the blankets shifted again, and a tiny shimmer caught Bruno's eye, a glimmer unmistakable to a man who had spent years seizing valuables from lands he considered spoils. Gold did not need to announce itself. It only needed a moment of truth. Bruno ordered the convoy to halt. The sudden stop rippled uneasily through the soldiers, who had grown accustomed to avoiding unnecessary delays. As they surrounded the miner, Bruno stepped forward with the calm authority of someone used to taking. Korpi stood silently, shoulders broad and steady, his eyes unreadable behind weathered lines. He looked like a man carved from the same stone as the northern fells, patient, enduring, unwilling to bend, simply because someone in a uniform demanded it. The soldiers explored the edge of the sled, lifting blankets with careless hands. Bruno leaned forward just as one of his men uncovered the small pouch, hidden beneath layers of tools. Even closed, it carried a weight that needed no explanation. The soldier holding it glanced at Bruno and shook his head in disbelief. Gold was not supposed to exist out here. Not like this. Not in the hands of a solitary wanderer crossing a broken landscape. Bruno extended his hand and took the pouch himself. Its weight settled into his palm like the promise of an escape route, more valuable than any allegiance. The retreat, the hunger, the cold, none of it mattered in that moment. What mattered was the quiet clink from inside the pouch, a sound sharp enough to slice through the numbness of war fatigue. Bruno studied Korpi with renewed interest, realizing this silent stranger had walked through the same ruins they had, yet somehow carried a fortune more powerful than any weapon. Korpi reached out slightly, his expression tightening just enough to reveal the smallest trace of protest. But the soldiers around him shifted, blocking his path, their boots scraping the ice as they formed a ring that left him standing alone and outnumbered. The air thickened with the cold breath of men who had lost too much to let opportunity slip past. Bruno stepped closer, not striking, not threatening, simply letting the imbalance of power settle into the space between them like a decision already made. He signaled for his men to take what they wished from the sled, leaving Korpi with nothing but the silence that followed their choices. The confrontation lasted only minutes, shaped by words never spoken and resistance never expressed aloud. When the soldiers returned to their vehicles, the gold pouch was tucked into Bruno's coat as though it had always belonged there. Laughter rose from the convoy, the nervous, brittle laughter of men who believed fortune had finally tilted their way after months of loss. They drove off with quickened urgency, engines rumbling across the tundra. Convinced the miner behind them had been reduced to insignificance by a moment of greed, the road fell silent again. Snow drifted over the footprints and sled tracks. The sun sank lower, casting long shadows that reached toward the still figure left alone on the frozen ground. Minutes passed, the wind softened. And then, in that wide, empty landscape where the wolves in uniform believed they had ended a chapter, the miner they had dismissed began to move slowly, steadily, with the same quiet resolve that had carried him through every storm before this one. Some men fight for survival. Others fight because they've already lost everything. In the frozen quiet of Lapland, after the convoy disappeared into the white horizon with his stolen future, Aatami Korpi lay half-buried in snow and silence. The wind skimmed over him in thin, cutting waves, carrying the scent of burned pine and distant engine fumes. His breath came shallow, steady, refusing to surrender despite every reason the world gave him to let go. Snow drifted across his back, settling into the folds of his clothes and stiffening around him like an icy shroud. Any ordinary man would have faded into stillness. But Aatami was not an ordinary man. The cold pressed against him with ruthless patience, searching for weakness. It crept along his spine, crawled around his ribs, and tried to dull the pulse that beat stubbornly inside his chest. Yet something older than fear stirred within him, something forged long before the war, long before gold, long before the wilderness had swallowed his grief. Sisu was not a word he ever spoke aloud. It lived in him as instinct, as memory, as refusal. The snow that tried to bury him became the very thing that slowed his bleeding, cooled his skin, and anchored him between life and the silence beyond it. A faint tremor traveled through his fingers as the air shifted. Awareness returned to him in pieces, the faint vibration of the retreating trucks, the fading laughter of men who believed they had broken him, and the distant crackle of a burning structure carried by the wind. When he finally pushed an elbow against the snow, the movement was small, yet certain. His body felt heavy, sore, and cold to the marrow, but it moved. That alone separated him from the grave the world kept trying to assign him. As he rose, one knee at a time, memories flickered behind his eyes, like old film reels unspooling in an abandoned theater. Not memories he chose, but the ones that refused to fade. A shattered home, smoke curling through the rafters with the same eerie grace as a funeral procession, the outline of a family extinguished by forces that cared nothing for the people caught between nations. The echoes of losses he had never spoken aloud followed him through every waking hour. The Soviets had once sent whole platoons to hunt a man they called the Phantom of Rovaniemi, a commando whose presence on the battlefield turned confidence into dread. They had feared him, not because of brutality, but because he moved with silence, precision, and the uncanny patience of the northern wilds. When the war ended for everyone else, it had not ended for him. His service uniform had been folded away beside the ashes of his home, and he had walked into the wilderness seeking something unshaped by violence. He had hoped to lose himself in vastness, to let the seasons erode the memories that clung to him. But now, with his hard-won future taken from him, the part of himself he had tried to bury stirred awake with cold, quiet clarity. He reached his sled, overturned and half-frozen into the snow, its contents scattered by the soldiers. His tools lay nearby the shovel, his pack, a few provisions. He found his knife wedged beneath a drift, its edge dulled but intact. With slow, deliberate care, he sharpened it against a stone he kept in his pocket, each scrape echoing in the frozen stillness like a quiet vow. The reindeer stood nearby, unsettled yet loyal, its breath rising in pale plumes. Aatami checked the harness, adjusted the sled's damaged frame, and prepared for a journey that no longer aimed toward safety. It aimed toward reclamation. By dusk, the traces of the convoy's passing had settled into a long stripe carved across the tundra. Aatami followed it with a pace that seemed deceptively calm. The snow muted the world, turning each step into a whisper. Trees lining the path grew dense in places, their branches heavy with frost, forming a corridor of shadow that mirrored the darkness gathering. In his thoughts, He knew the terrain better than any man in that retreating column. He understood how the wind masked movement, how frozen earth hummed beneath approaching engines, how rivers created natural routes that cautious soldiers avoided, but desperate ones followed. As the convoy slowed to navigate a narrow pass between rocky outcrops, Aatami had already positioned himself along an upper ridge. No violence marked his intent, only strategy shaped by experience. He moved stones into place, shifted snow along a treacherous slope, and positioned branches in subtle patterns. None of it was designed to wound. It was meant to confuse, delay, and disrupt. When the trucks reached the narrowest point, the terrain responded to his careful alterations. Snow slid with deceptive grace, obscuring the path. A small cascade of loose rock forced the lead vehicle to halt, its drivers stepping out warily as they debated the safest way through. The soldiers fanned out, scanning the shadows. They found no attacker, no trap they could name aloud, only a landscape subtly rearranged in a way that unsettled their nerves. A gust of wind carried flakes across their boots, erasing their own tracks as quickly as they made them. One soldier muttered that the land itself seemed to resist their passage. Another argued that nothing here was accidental. Each time they attempted to push forward, some new inconvenience emerged. A fallen branch, a slick patch of ice, a sudden shift in the wind that obscured visibility. Aatami observed from a distance, noting every hesitation and every flinch. His silence became its own form of pressure. He did not confront them. He controlled the land they stood on. By the time night deepened around them, the men who had once laughed at the miner they believed beaten had begun to sense a pattern they couldn't quite define. Footsteps felt watched. The wind carried shapes that vanished when approached. The convoy's progress grew slower, more cautious, more fragmented. Bruno Heldorf, always more perceptive than his men, studied the snowy ridges with narrowed eyes. He felt the shift in the air, the quiet tension of a land responding to an unseen hand. And in that subtle, growing unease, the truth settled over him like cold ash. They were no longer alone on the tundra. They were no longer the hunters of misfortune. Something in the wilderness moved with purpose, with intelligence, with the patience of a man who had endured more than any uniformed force could impose. The Iron Wolves realized they were being hunted, and the hunter they thought they had left for dead was very much alive. When death walks behind you, every shadow becomes a battlefield. The German convoy that had swaggered across the northern tundra now crawled forward in fractured fear. The men who once laughed at the quiet miner were shaken into suspicion, stopping every few minutes to peer into the drifting snow as if the landscape itself monitored them. Their retreat had become a march of doubt, punctured by the growing certainty that something unseen moved through the wilderness with them. Captain Bruno Heldorf, usually rigid and controlled, paced along the halted line of vehicles with restless energy. His officers attempted to reassert order, forcing the soldiers to set up makeshift traps that relied more on desperation than strategy. They hammered poles into the frozen soil to string crude alarms from canteens and wire. Others ignited the edges of the forest, hoping the smoke and flame would force any unseen pursuer into visibility. The crisp pop of frozen bark bursting under heat echoed through the valley like distant rifle cracks, unsettling men already stretched thin by fear. Prisoners, hollow-eyed and exhausted, were arranged near the convoy's center. Some were forced to walk ahead of the vehicles as reluctant scouts, their presence a grim reflection of how terrified the soldiers had become. The women in the rear truck exchanged glances marked by shared dread, yet there was an undercurrent of something more complicated, a flicker of hope, fragile but alive. Their captors believed they controlled the terrain by manipulating fear, but they had misjudged the quiet persistence of the man following them. Aatami Korpi remained a presence, without a pattern. He moved with the terrain, never forcing a confrontation, never revealing a clear signature. One moment he was a shadow near a wind-battered ridge. The next, he was a faint trace in the snow near a frozen ravine. He knew the land intimately, understanding how wind shaped sound, and how the cold thinned caution. He adjusted the environment subtly, shifting branches that caused passing patrols to lose direction, loosening rocks in narrow passages that startled drivers into abandoning their vehicles. guiding their path like a shepherd steering a panicked flock. As the convoy advanced into a narrow corridor between two fells, a hidden German mine, one they themselves had placed months earlier, erupted in a sheet of white and earth. The explosion sent a ripple of panic down the line, not from injuries, but from the realization that their own carelessness had become their enemy. The frontmost tank lurched sideways, smoke curling from its vents, and for a moment the entire retreat froze. Soldiers scrambled to decipher whether the blast had been triggered by sabotage or misfortune. Their voices echoed across the tundra, threaded with unease. Korpi remained unseen, watching from a distant outcrop as the soldiers scrambled to re-establish control. His expression revealed nothing, but his mind mapped every reaction, every fragment of fear, every unraveling thread of discipline. He moved again, guiding his reindeer along a hidden path behind a hill that paralleled the convoy's projected route. He did not seek confrontation, he sought inevitabilities. Where the land dipped into marsh, he shifted the snow to conceal deep patches of unstable ice. Where a ravine funneled sound, he placed metal scraps he retrieved from a burned cottage, letting them clatter softly in the wind like whispered warnings. By morning, the convoy looked less like a structured military force and more like a caravan unraveling under invisible pressure. Officers barked orders that dissolved into confusion. Soldiers jumped at shadows shaped by drifting snow. Some attempted to abandon their posts, only to be pulled back by the fear of punishment. The pressure built slowly, tightening around the convoy like a noose made of silence. In the back of a truck, one of the Finnish women whispered a truth that felt older than myth. He's not a man. He's revenge itself. Her words drifted through the cramped space, settling into the thoughts of the prisoners, who had witnessed the convoy's deteriorating unity. They had seen men lose composure not from open conflict, but from the unnerving realization that they no longer controlled their surroundings. Their captors had turned ruthless out of fear, not strength. Every step through the snow felt like it belonged to someone else, as though they were trespassing in a place ruled by a force that didn't need visibility to dominate. The discipline that once defined German efficiency fractured into conflicting instincts. Some soldiers insisted on accelerating their pace to outrun the unseen threat. Others urged caution, fearing the terrain had become a web of invisible dangers. Their arguments rose sharply, bouncing off frost-glazed boulders and tall spruces like warnings carried by the forest itself. Bruno tried to maintain command, but the land, no longer responded to him. The tundra had become a living reflection of the anxiety in his ranks, shifting with the weight of their uncertainty. In the afternoon, clouds pushed low across the sky, pressing the world into a muted twilight. It was in that half-light that Korpi positioned himself ahead of the convoy, choosing a spot where the road narrowed between two high ridges. He moved with calm deliberation, arranging rocks and loose branches so subtly that no soldier would question them. The wind picked up, pushing snow across the trail in gentle sheets. To the untrained eye, the pass looked unchanged. But to someone who understood the land, it had been transformed into a silent threshold, not a trap, but a statement. When the lead vehicle approached the pass, Bruno rode beside it, scanning the flanking hills. His instincts flared with warnings he couldn't articulate. Something in the air felt compressed, charged with quiet intention. The soldiers around him fell silent, their breath hanging in frost as they waited for him to signal the next move. The forest rustled with a low murmur, as though watching. The snow under their boots seemed too still, too expectant. Bruno raised his hand, intending to order a halt, but before he could speak, a shape moved along the ridge above, not a strike, not an attack, but a shadow shifting with unmistakable purpose. A reminder that the man they believed buried in the snow had not only survived, but had woven himself into the landscape ahead of them. Heldorf's jaw tightened with a mix of anger and apprehension. He vowed, quietly and fiercely, that he would end this ghost before the tundra swallowed them all. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that Aatami Korpi was already waiting for him just beyond the ridge, as patient as winter, and far more relentless. There's a point in war when courage turns to madness, and madness becomes unstoppable. As dawn settled like pale glass across the tundra, The retreating convoy approached the last intact crossing before the border roads dissolved into wilderness. The bridge was a narrow timber span stretched over a frozen river whose surface shifted under the pressure of early melt. It stood like a fragile reminder of a world that once connected rather than divided. Beneath its planks, icy water churned with restless energy, echoing the rising tension in every soldier's breath. Captain Bruno Heldorf surveyed the bridge with a mix of relief and suspicion. The structure looked worn, patched by local labor long before war turned the region into ruins. Snow clung to the railings and drifted along the beams, but the path appeared passable. For the moment, it seemed like an exit from a land that had grown hostile with every step. Yet, the silence around it felt deliberate, as though the air itself waited for a decision that would alter everything. The convoy gathered hesitantly, engines rumbling with uneven rhythm. Soldiers exchanged glances, weighted with apprehension, remembering every unexplained setback that had haunted their journey. Officers attempted to rally discipline, shouting orders that spread thin across the cold morning. They instructed men to check the planks, test the rails, and clear the approach. Each step produced a hollow thump that reverberated through the structure, creating a cadence that heightened their doubts rather than soothing them. The first truck rolled forward, its tires crunching over frost-crusted wood. The river beneath groaned with the defiant hum of early thaw, and the bridge responded with a tremor that made even the most composed soldiers tighten their grips on the railings. Bruno walked alongside the lead vehicle, his boots tapping carefully, his eyes scanning the surrounding ridges. He sensed something unfinished in the air, something that refused to let them cross without consequence. Unbeknownst to the convoy, Aatami Korpi had reached the bridge hours earlier. He had studied its structure with the precision of someone who understood both nature and necessity. He positioned fuel barrels scavenged from abandoned outposts along the riverbank, arranging them discreetly among scattered rocks and brittle shrubs. He placed small devices scavenged from the debris of earlier battles near the support beams, not with the intention of open assault, but with an understanding that pressure and timing could create a shift large enough to stop an army without direct confrontation. His preparation wasn't driven by vengeance alone. It was shaped by the knowledge that this crossing was the final escape route for men who had stripped the land of peace. As the convoy began to inch across the bridge in a single, stretched line, Korpi observed from a hidden vantage along the southern ridge. His breath formed thin clouds that dissolved in the breeze, his eyes following each hesitant step of the soldiers. The calm around him felt almost unreal, yet it carried a firmness that mirrored his resolve. Everything he had lost, everything he had endured, crystallized into a single moment of focus. He waited for the right shifts in weight, the alignment of vehicles, the precise instant when the convoy committed fully to the crossing. Below, the barrels shifted as the river's current nudged them into position. A faint ripple crossed their reflective surfaces, catching the early light in a muted shimmer. The subtle movement signaled the sequence Korpi had orchestrated, a convergence of nature, machinery, and carefully placed pressure points. As the tank in the center of the bridge inched forward, the undercarriage pressed down on a weakened segment of the beam. Snow fell in thin sheets from its treads, swirling through the air in ghost-like spirals. The soldiers sensed the change before they could name it. A hush washed over the entire convoy as the structure beneath them groaned with growing tension. Bruno halted mid-step, his instincts catching the tremor that ran through the planks. He spun toward his officers, ready to issue a command to retreat, but the sound that followed cut through the air with quiet finality. The barrels ignited not with an explosion, but with a deep, rolling bloom of flame that consumed the base of the bridge in a sweeping cascade of heat and smoke. The wooden supports bowed as fire rushed along their length, creating a barrier of searing light that separated the soldiers from safety. The icy river reflected the blaze, turning the water into a mirror of flickering gold and red. Men scrambled to regain footing as the planks shifted and cracked under the sudden weight redistribution. Some vehicles halted abruptly, engines sputtering, while drivers searched for stable ground. The bridge transformed into a corridor of heat, where wood, metal, and frost collided in a chaotic symphony of nature and war-torn machinery. Bruno shouted orders lost beneath the roar of the flames. He attempted to guide his men forward, but the path had become unpredictable, shaped by forces beyond his command. The soldiers' movements became slow and uncertain, their silhouettes shifting through smoke that curled around them like restless spirits. On the ridge, Korpi watched without flinching. The heat brushed his face even from a distance, warming the cold lines etched by his long journey. The bridge, once a fragile link between destruction and escape, became a marker in his pursuit, a point at which determination overcame despair. He knew the flames would not claim everyone. The structure would fail in segments, allowing some to retreat, forcing others to scatter. But the chaos mattered more than the count. It fragmented the convoy, leaving its unity broken beyond repair. When the final supports gave way, a deep groan echoed through the valley. The center portion of the bridge collapsed into the river, sending plumes of steam rising where cold water clashed with lingering fire. Vehicles stranded on either side stood frozen in place, their drivers stunned by the sudden shift from confidence to disarray. Through the veil of smoke, Korpi stepped from his ridge and descended the slope, moving with measured steadiness. The flames faded behind him as the cold reclaimed the air, filling every breath with a sharp clarity of purpose. He bore new scars across his clothes and skin, remnants of proximity to heat and debris. But they only deepened the expression of relentless endurance etched across his face. Cinematic narration filled the weight of the moment. He had nothing left but vengeance, and that was enough. On the northern side of the fallen bridge, Captain Heldorf gathered what remained of his corps officers. Their faces were drawn, their ranks reduced to a handful. They looked at their captain with a mixture of desperation and expectation, waiting for leadership to shape their next step. Bruno straightened his coat, jaw set, conviction hardening into something fierce. He vowed to confront the ghost who had turned their retreat into a reckoning. What he didn't see, hidden by drifting smoke and shifting snow, was Aatami Korpi, already moving along the riverbank, following the broken remnants of the convoy. The final hunt had begun, and the man they feared was coming for the last of them next. When the earth failed to kill him, they sent the sky. The last stretch of the frozen frontier had collapsed into a wasteland of shattered vehicles, rising smoke, and fractured discipline. Captain Bruno Heldorf, stripped of command and surrounded by the remnants of what once resembled an army, saw no path forward except escape. At the edge of a desolate airstrip, one the Germans had used in more coordinated days, sat a weather-worn aircraft. Its wings rimed with frost, its engines coughing in the cold. It was never meant to carry stolen treasure or the last hope of a defeated officer, yet Heldorf clutched the gold pouch to his chest as if it were his final claim to meaning. The aircraft's engines growled to life with uneven confidence. Soldiers who remained loyal hurried to clear the path, pushing aside crates and tangled nets with frantic movements. Heldorf climbed aboard with movements that were too sharp to be called steady, glancing repeatedly toward the distant tree line, as if expecting the land itself to rise and stop him. Snow drifted across the runway in thin waves, catching the first sunlight as the plane gathered momentum. When its wheels finally tore free from the frozen earth, Heldorf released a breath that tasted like momentary triumph, unaware that fate had not loosened its grip on him. Far below, Aatami Korpi watched the plane rise. His breath came in measured clouds, his expression unchanged by the sight of the aircraft climbing into the pale morning. He had followed the remnants of the convoy through ravines and across frozen lakes, his pace calm even as the urgency around him tightened. The smoke from the broken bridge still clung to his clothes. His body bore new marks of the journey, scorched fabric, cuts from shattered wood, bruises from falling debris, yet he moved as if the pain threaded into the rhythm of each step. The gold that had been ripped from him once again slipped beyond reach, carried skyward by a man who believed altitude could grant safety. Korpi approached the abandoned runway with the clarity of someone who refused to measure possibility by ordinary limits. The airstrip held one remaining vehicle, a small supply plane partially fueled and left behind in the chaos. Its frame looked worn, its propellers stiff, but its bones were functional. The decision came to him without hesitation, shaped by instinct rather than deliberation. He climbed aboard, checked the fuel gauge, tested the controls, and coaxed the engine into motion with calm determination. The machine shuddered, coughed, then steadied. Snow blasted behind it as it rolled forward, carving a thin line across the ice. The ascent felt raw, the turbulence unpredictable. But Korpi kept his grip firm and his eyes fixed on the dark dot rising ahead. The sky above Lapland stretched vast and pale, an empty world where distance distorted judgment and every breath tasted thin. Heldorf's plane flew low at first, seeking stability. Before, climbing higher into cleaner air, the cold bit through metal and bone with equal insistence, turning the interior of both aircraft into frozen chambers suspended between earth and emptiness. Heldorf finally allowed himself a moment to relax. He traced the edges of the gold pouch with tired fingers, imagining a future rebuilt far from flames and failure. He pictured distant borders, new identities, quiet towns unscarred by war. For the first time in days, he felt the tension in his shoulders ease until the faint shape of another aircraft reflected in his side window. His jaw tightened, his hands froze around the controls. The impossible silhouette edged closer, its wings wobbling slightly in the turbulence as it cut through the pale sky like an accusation. Korpi drew near with quiet persistence, matching the plane's altitude with rough precision. The engines groaned in protest, but he coaxed every ounce of power from them. The cold wind whipped at the fuselage, but he held course. When the two aircraft finally flew in parallel, the gap between them narrowed into a space shaped by sheer will. The world below, endless snowfields, frost-glazed forests, scattered remnants of a land ravaged by loss, dissolved into a distant blur. Heldorf's face hardened. The gold weighed suddenly heavier, as if it recognized the man who pursued it. He jerked the controls, causing the plane to tilt abruptly, but Korpi adjusted with uncanny steadiness. Their paths crossed, in a dangerous dance, just beneath the cloud line. Heldorf attempted to shake his pursuer by plunging toward a pocket of turbulent air sweeping off the fells, hoping to force the second aircraft into retreat. Instead, Korpi matched every dive and turn with relentless focus. The chase turned the sky into a narrow corridor of reckoning. Frost coated the windows, engines strained, and loose debris rattled inside both cabins. When their wings nearly grazed, Korpi made his final move. He guided his plane, close enough to let the airflow between them shift dramatically, forcing Heldorf's aircraft into a jolt that sent it momentarily off balance. In that small window of instability, Korpi leapt from his cockpit toward the enemy plane, gripping its edge with hands that refused to release. He climbed with deliberate control, the wind tearing at his coat, the world below yawning in a white abyss. He reached the side hatch, pulling himself inside with effort shaped by sheer endurance. Heldorf spun around, eyes wide, not with fear but disbelief. The two men faced one another in the cramped interior, gold between them like a symbol neither could abandon. What followed was not physical combat, but a collision of wills, the captain's desperation tightening into frantic movements, Korpi's resolve shaping each action with calm inevitability. The plane wavered, dipping suddenly, as no one remained fully at the controls. The gold pouch slipped from Heldorf's grip, its contents scattering. Across the cabin, nuggets rolled toward the open hatch, catching sunlight before disappearing into the sky one by one, falling like streaks of molten light toward the frozen world below. The plane trembled harder as altitude dropped. Heldorf lunged for the remaining treasure, his fixation blinding him to the angle of descent. The aircraft tilted sharply, its engine coughing in protest. Korpi steadied himself against the bulkhead as the nose dipped. Heldorf, reaching for the last gleam of gold, lost his footing when the aircraft lurched. The motion swept him toward the cabin's far edge, disorienting him with sudden silence. The sky outside flared brighter as the descent steepened, clouds tearing apart around the falling plane. In those final seconds, the weight of greed eclipsed everything else. The aircraft struck the ground in a cascade of broken metal and displaced snow. The impact sent a shudder through the valley, scattering debris across an expanse already littered with war's remnants. Smoke drifted upward in slow coils, merging with the pale sky. From the wreckage, a figure emerged, slow at first, then steady. Aatami Korpi stepped through the settling smoke, coated in ash and frost, battered but unbroken. In his hand, he carried a single gold bar, its dull surface warmed by the heat of the crash. The tundra lay quiet around him as he walked forward, leaving behind the broken machine, the scattered treasure, and the man who believed altitude could save him from consequence. The sky had burned, but Korpi endured, and the journey was not yet finished. Gold can be lost, but spirit that never dies. As smoke faded from the wreckage on the tundra and the wind carried away the last traces of fire, Aatami Korpi walked alone across the frozen expanse with a single gold bar held firmly in his hand. The world around him stretched silent and immense, shaped by a century of storms and years of war. His coat was torn, his hair stiff with frost, and the weight of his long journey rested across his shoulders like a second winter. Yet his steps were steady. Nothing in his posture hinted at triumph or despair, only a deep, enduring resolve carved from the very landscape he crossed. The nearer he drew to civilization, the more the emptiness gave way to scattered signs of life returning. Smoke drifted from distant chimneys. Farmhouses, once abandoned under the threat of retreating armies, now displayed faint stirrings behind frosted windows. Roads were no longer marked by the passage of tank treads, but by simple sleigh lines and the tentative footprints of villagers reclaiming their routines. Even the sky seemed gentler, its pale glow stretching across the horizon like a quiet benediction. Korpi walked through it all with the same measured rhythm, carrying with him an air of weathered certainty. When he reached the edge of the small northern town, people paused to watch him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. They saw a man marked by hardship, streaked with the residue of burnt metal and broken earth, walking with the steadiness of someone who no longer measured danger the way ordinary men did. Some recognized him. Most only sensed that he carried stories too heavy to speak aloud. He passed them without shifting his expression, without slowing his pace, as if he moved between worlds, one foot in the territory of the living, the other in memories shaped by shadows and long nights. The town's bank stood in the center, a sturdy wooden building with frost-laced windows and a door worn by the hands of generations. Light spilled from inside, warm and steady. Korpi stepped through the threshold, the quiet murmur of conversation falling away as the room stilled. The clerk behind the counter looked up, eyes widening fractionally before settling into a respectful composure. Korpi reached into his coat and placed the gold bar on the counter with deliberate calm. Its dull gleam caught the lantern light, revealing edges scratched by impact and surfaces clouded by soot. No words were exchanged. The clerk read everything he needed to know in Korpi's weary eyes: the journey, the cost, the unspoken desire, not for wealth but for closure. Slowly, with the practiced movements of someone accustomed to handling valuables, he weighed the bar, noted its purity, and prepared the ledger. Coins and notes were placed on the counter with a certain reverence, as though acknowledging that this exchange was more than a transaction. It was a passing of burden. Korpi collected the payment without counting it, slipping, put it into his pocket, before giving a small nod and turning to leave. The moment held no celebration, only understanding. Outside, the northern wind brushed across his face, cold but no longer biting. The streets echoed with the subdued sounds of a community rebuilding itself after years of uncertainty, hammering from a repaired roof, the creak of a wagon. Quiet conversations carried through open doors. As Korpi stepped into this renewed rhythm, the narration of his life intersected with the larger story of his land. Sisu, the Finnish spirit, lingered in every corner of the recovering town. It infused the breath of men mending fences, women carrying firewood, children clearing snow from steps. It was a force shaped not by defiance alone, but by endurance, a stubborn, quiet resilience that surfaced when reason had long since surrendered. Sisu was the ability to keep moving when every path was broken, to find meaning in the ruins, to lift one's gaze even when the world around demanded retreat. It lived in the landscapes that had survived invasions and winters alike. It lived in the families rebuilding homes from scorched beams and shattered glass. And it lived in Aatami Korpi, whose journey mirrored a nation's struggle not for glory, but for the dignity of simply refusing to fall. Images of Finland's post-war landscape unfolded in a slow, poignant montage. Burned forests beginning to sprout new saplings, charred homesteads rising once again beneath the hands of those who had returned, Fields once torn by artillery, now smoothed by the quiet persistence of planting seasons. Lakes reflecting skies washed clean by time. Amid these scenes, the scars remained reminders etched into soil and memory. But alongside them ran threads of renewal, subtle yet unbreakable. The war had ended, but the work of reclaiming identity had only just begun. In this quiet rebirth, Korpi's presence became a symbol not of violence or revenge, but of perseverance. He represented every soldier who had walked into impossible circumstances and returned, changed yet unbroken. Every civilian who had endured the weight of conflict without recognition. Every forgotten individual whose courage had never reached the pages of official history. His silent return to town echoed the unspoken truth of survival. Triumph was rarely loud, and victory was often measured in the simple act of carrying on. At the edge of the town, Korpi paused. Snow drifted gently at his feet, and the sky above stretched wide and calm. The road ahead held no certainty, no promise of comfort or rest. Yet he stepped toward it with the same unyielding motion that had defined his entire journey. The spirit within him, forged in loss, sharpened by endurance, sustained by purpose, remained steady. Empires rise and fall, but the spirit of Sisu walks on in the hearts of those who never break. Stories of unbreakable spirit and forgotten heroes move you. Stay with this journey until the final frame. It's crafted for those who refuse to blink when courage is tested. Your support keeps these hidden moments of history alive, reaching those who still believe resilience can rewrite destiny. Share this story with someone who'd walk through fire for what matters, and join the community that honors strength carved from struggle. And before you go, tell me this. If everything was taken from you, what part of your spirit would still refuse to break?